Viewer discretion is advised.
Hey guys, welcome back. Today we will be talking about the Colorado Cannibal, also known as Alfred Packer. He did go by Alfred, but I'm just gonna call him by his actual name. Um, the beginning, of his life before his doings, it is quite short. There wasn't much information on it, so yeah. Alfred was born January 21st, 1842, in Allegheny County, Pennsylvania, to James Packer and Esther Greiner. By the 1850s, his father moved his family to LaGrange County, Indiana, where he worked as a cabinet maker, and then in his later teens, he moved to Minnesota and worked as a shoemaker. At 20 years old, Alfred served in the Union Army during the American Civil War. He enlisted on April 22, 1862, in Winona, Wisconsin. He was assigned to Company F of the 16th Infantry Regiment. 8 months later, he was honorably discharged due to epilepsy. For those who don't know what that is a seizure disorder. And me, myself, I can personally say it's a really scary thing to live with sometimes. On June 25th, 1863, Alfred enlisted in the 8th Iowa Cavalry Regiment at Ottumwa, Iowa, only to be discharged again April 22nd, 1864, due to his epilepsy. Afterwards, Alfred traveled west and worked numerous jobs for the next 9 years. The jobs included being a hunter, a wagon teamster, ranch hand, and field worker. The job ceased to last due to his epilepsy and overall attitude. He also ended up doing mining-related jobs, but never found prosperity through the industry. He worked for a short time in the Colorado Territory, but without having luck, he moved to the Utah Territory. Most people who knew Alfred generally disliked and distrusted him, owing to his argumentative personality, his nearly pathological lying, and his reputation of theft. I'm sorry if you can hear what's going on outside. I don't know if you can or not, but somebody's mowing, so it's going to be quite loud. But now we are going on to the expedition. In November of 1873, 20 men left for Bigham Canyon mines near Salt Lake City for the gold fields of Breckenridge in the Colorado Territory. The men were largely strangers to one another and banded together to make their fortune in Colorado. A member of the original party, George Tracy, claimed that the men encountered Alfred some 25 miles from their starting point near Bravo. Alfred asked where they were headed, and when he heard they were headed to the gold country of the San Juan Mountains, he said he would like to join them. Alfred was without money and also lacked adequate supplies. So the men were anxious to bring him along, but he told the men he was both a prospector and a guide, and knew the San Juan territory well. Members of the original party later said Alfred had vastly overstated his experience of being a seasoned guide familiar to the area. He was also reported as being without a rifle at the time the expedition left, only a Colt revolver. Throughout the time of their journey, Alfred was reported being greedy, a bit of a beggar, lazy, and stubborn. He also reported to have argued constantly with party member Frank Miller. The party made less than sufficient progress towards their designation. The winter was becoming a major obstacle for them, as the wagons and horses of assemblage were being bogged down, along with the fact the Spanish trail they were likely following was becoming heavily snowed over, forcing the men to rely mostly on a compass. Alfred's inexperience was also beginning to show itself, and the party ultimately became lost. On January 21st, 1874, the party came upon the encampment of Chief Array, known as the White Man's Friend, near Montrose, Colorado. The men were desperate but still approached the camp with fear, unsure how they would be received by the tribe. Although they reportedly scared off some of the youths by the way they looked, Chief Array greeted them as welcome guests and supplied them with food and lodging. He recommended they postpone their expedition since they were likely to encounter dangerous winter weathers in the mountains. He told them not even any youth would attempt this journey because it would most likely result in death. Breckenridge was being descended upon by miners all over the country, and the fear of missing out on the riches made some of the men anxious to continue on. After weeks of staying with Chief Array and his people, the party discussed leaving. However, it was the beginning of February at this point, and the snow had been relentless since they got there, meaning half of the party was forced to stay until spring. 11 men were encumbered, so they decided to proceed on. They intended to travel first to Los Pinos Indian Agency, which was the closest output to the camp, and proceeded onward to Breckenridge from there. Chief Array saw that there was no convincing the men and gave them food for the journey as well as safe directions to bypass the mountains. Alfred, however, was in favor of going through the mountains, stating it was a more direct route. On February 9th, Alfred and 5 others in his party left for Los Pinos, intending to transverse the mountains. Besides Alfred, the group comprised Shannon Bell, James Humphrey, Frank Miller, George Noon, and Israel Swan. The fact that no one in the other group opposed the departure of their guide has led many researchers to conclude that Alfred's inexperience and overall attitude had become quite taxing to them and that they'd be better off without him. The men in Alfred's party had a 75-mile journey ahead of them. The leader of both parties, Bob McGrew, guided Alfred's party along the river route advised by Chief Array. McGrew unloaded the men's provisions and headed back to Array's camp. The men continued along the river before Alfred took his party along the path higher up to San Juan Mountains, disregarding Array's warning. Also, I'm just going to add, you will hear my kid screaming in the back because she just woke up. Now, the aftermath. On April 16, 1874, Alfred came out from the woods alone and stumbled his way across the lake bed to the agency with rags lashed to his feet. As the men of the agency sat in the mess hall eating breakfast, the door flung open and Alfred stood there before begging them for food and shelter. The men hurried him inside, sat him down, and gave him something to eat, which then he threw up as quickly as he ate. Packer said that his digestion was messed up as a result of his longly near starvation. After taking a few shots of whiskey, he told the men the events leading up to Array's camp and that he'd been hired by 5 men to guide them to Breckenridge from there. He stated that during their journey, he had become snowblind and was lagging behind the remainder of his party, becoming a burden to them. Alfred claimed that a member of the party, Israel Swan, supplied him with a rifle and then they all abandoned him. He then claimed he was forced to survive on his own and make his way out of the mountains with minimal ammunition and no supplies and had eaten little else than roots and rosebuds the time he was alone. The men at the agency listened to his story but found it weird that even though he had been lost in the wilderness for around 2 months, he did not look as malnourished and threadbare as most lost people they had come across before. Alfred's face was reported being bloated and his overall physique was hardly slim. He claimed he was broke and sold the rifle he had in his possession to Mayor Downer, the agency's Justice of the Peace, for $10, equivalent to $269 in 2023. Alfred stayed at the agency for 10 days before he expressed that he wished to go back home to Pennsylvania and then headed to the nearby town Saguache to buy supplies for his journey. When he reached the town, Alfred made arrangements to stay in Dolan's saloon. Larry Dolan, the owner, claimed that Alfred spent around $100, equivalent to $2,693 in 2023 during his stay, and that he was also offered to lend him $300 more. Alfred also spent $78 in Otto Mears general store. Okay, we're back. It was also claimed that he had several different wallets in his possession. Alfred drank heavily, and after becoming intoxicated, he gave conflicting stories regarding his journey and how he came to be separated from the other men. This led to quick gossip among the townspeople, given his inconsistent story, seemingly endless cash flow, and the fact that his party was still unheard from. Preston Nutter, a member of the original party who remained at Ore's camp, arrived in Saguache around this time with two other original party members. He encountered Alfred in Dolan's saloon, drinking and carrying on. Preston asked Alfred where the rest of his party was, with Alfred claiming that he had got his feet wet and frozen. He stated that they had set up camp when a winter storm set in, and he started a fire to warm up while the others went ahead and looked for food. Alfred claimed that Israel left him with his rifle in case of trouble and that they never returned. He presumed they had abandoned him. Alfred claimed he was forced to leave the party to an unknown fate, as he had no idea where they went when they left him, and lived mainly on rosebuds and the occasional squirrel as he made his journey out. You want to help me read? It's scary. Preston thought his story odd, considering that Alfred looked rather well fed and that it was to be a fatal choice for 5 miners unfamiliar with Colorado to abandon their guide in a snowbound mountain of the territory he claimed to know well. Preston also thought it was odd that Israel would give Alfred his rifle, leaving the group of four with only one rifle, as a means of a shooting game. Additionally, he noted that Alfred had in his possession a skinning knife that had belonged to Frank. When Preston asked Alfred how he came to have it, he claimed that Frank had stuck it in a tree and walked off without it. Having doubts about Alfred's story from the beginning, Preston was convinced that something criminal had happened. Preston had come to view Alfred in the same negative light as others, based on his behavior leading up to their arrival at Array's camp. Accusations were flung and words were exchanged, with Preston threatening to hang Alfred. Preston later stated regarding Alfred, he was sulky, obstinate, and quarrelsome. He was a petty thief willing to take things that did not belong to him, whether of any value or not. The two men were separated, and Alfred made plans to move on. You want to read the next part? Meanwhile, back at the agency, two men of the 5-man party that had taken the Gunnison River route before being rescued by government cowhands finally arrived at their destination. They were joined a few days later by the remaining 3 men, including Oliver Lutzenheiser. The men were introduced to the head of the agency, General Charles Adams, who greeted them and relayed to them that he had already received another member of their party by the name of Alfred Packer, and that he spoke of abandonment at the hands of his companions. All 5 men at once discredited what Alfred had told the general and his staff, stating that the men that they had known would never abandon a man to die. Oliver flatly told the general that Alfred was not to be trusted and that he was sure that something bad had happened in the mountains. He noted the rifle carried in by Alfred belonged to an elderly man in his party, and that a pipe he had left behind at the agency belonged to a man named Shannon Bell, who was also a member of his party. The men convinced General Adams to dispatch a mountain agency officer to Saguache at once to retrieve Alfred for questioning, but under the likeliness of recruiting him for a search party for the missing men. Alfred was processed of getting the things gathered to leave the area when he was again approached by Preston and some other men. The agency officer arrived just in time and got between the men. He told Alfred he had been sent to enlist him as a guide for the search party for the missing men. Alfred was reluctant to go, but with little other option than vigilant justice, he agreed. He mounted his recently purchased horse and followed the officer back to Los Pinos, but not before Preston had a private chat with the officer. I'm just gonna say now, I am sorry for all of the interruptions. Normally, my daughter is able to sleep like throughout recording, but today's just one of those days, and that's okay. So now we're going on to the confessions. Upon arriving at the agency, Alfred came face to face with General Adams and 5 men he had not seen since February. The agency officer came in, bless you, after Alfred and relayed to General Adams that a man named Preston had told him Alfred had spent several $100s over his 6 week stay in Sawatch, as well as buying a new horse and saddle, that he was in possession of things that belonged to missing men, and that he was penniless when he had originally joined their party. Demanded an explanation from Alfred, who repeated the story exactly as he had told it the first time. Alfred showed amazement that the men had not been heard from and was concerned for their well being. That is total BS. Oliver scoffed at his story, demanding to know where his new wealth came from. Alfred stated that he had received a cash loan from a man in Sawatch. Adams told Alfred that if this were true, then he would not mind staying at the agency while the officer was sent back to Sawatch to verify his story. Alfred agreed, but with minimum hesitation. The officer was dispatched at once, and after a short while returned with news from various sources that Alfred had been seen with several different wallets and had told varying stories regarding his journey. Alfred had arrived in Sawatch with plenty of cash, and no one in town claimed to have given him even a penny. Adams put together a council of the 5 miners, himself, Alfred, and the agency officers to settle the matter. As they began the proceedings, 2 Ute tribesmen rushed into the agency holding strips of dried human flesh. They referred to as white man's meat, which they had found on a hill near the agency while hunting. That's disgusting. Alfred reportedly fainted and crumbled to the floor. He was revived and profusely began begging for mercy, swearing to make a full confession. After a long silence, he cryptically stated to Adams it would not be the first time that people had been obliged to eat each other when they were hungry. Alfred slowly and sobbingly began to tell what was to become one of the several different official statements over the next 3 decades. Alfred signed his first confession. Old Man Swan died first and was eaten by the other 5 persons about 10 days out of camp. 4 or 5 days afterwards, Humphreys died and was also eaten. He had about $133. I found the pocketbook and took the money. Sometime afterwards, while I was carrying wood, the butcher was killed, as the other 2 told me accidentally, and he was also eaten. Bell shot California with Swan's gun, and I killed Bell. Shot him. I covered up the remains and took a large piece along. Then traveled 14 days into the agency. Bell wanted to kill me with his rifle, struck a tree, and broke his gun. In Alfred's later altered version of the story, the men had endured almost 20 days from Array's camp and more than 10 days without any substantial food at all. Alfred elaborated that James Humphrey had also died of exposure to the extreme cold, and that George Noon was killed days later by Shannon Bell for the sole purpose of food. After, there was no more substantial meat to be had from the 3 fallen men. Then it was just down to Bell and himself. He claimed that he and Bell had agreed that they would stand together until the end, swearing not to eat each other. Days went by, and Bell could no longer take the hunger and rushed at Alfred with his rifle, intending to bat him with its stock. Alfred then shot Shannon with his pistol. Alfred confessed to taking the valuables of the deceased members, claiming they no longer needed them, and made no statement as to the exact items taken nor the amount of money taken. Discovering of bodies. And I'm just gonna put a trigger warning because it is pretty graphic. The following August, the site of the incident was discovered by John Randolph, an illustrator who worked for Harper's Weekly magazine. He discovered all 5 of the bodies at the foot of Slumgullion Pass, 2 miles southeast of Lake City, Colorado, in a pine-shaded gulch skirted by hemlock trees. They lay above the lake fork of the Gunnison River, now known familiarly as Dead Man's Gulch, which matched the description of where Alfred had originally claimed that only Bell had met his end. The men would have been well within hiking distance of the nearby city had they descended the lake fork instead of transversing up it, especially in their claimed desperate situation, but Alfred was the guide. The snow that had been covering the bodies and the campsite had melted in an intervening 4 months. John sketched the scene as he found it and then alerted authorities in nearby Lake City. The local coroner and law enforcement set out for the site along with about 20 volunteers and discovered the bodies of all 5 men in many different states of decomposition, having been left to the elements and animals for 4 months. First responders to the site noted that it appeared that extreme violence had hit the men and it was stinking with the smell of death. Frank Miller's head was missing entirely from the campsite. His and Israel's corpses had been considerably worked upon by scavengers and were little more than scattered bones. Israel's skull had a jagged chunk missing out of it, and it was presumed that Frank's head had been carried away by an animal. The bodies of George Noon and James Humphrey were largely flayed torsos of rotting organs attached to skeletal legs, but with intact and bearded faces. With James' face being slightly more decayed than George's, they had received blows to the head, the shape indicating perhaps a hatchet, and their bodies had noticeable broken bones. Shannon Bell laid with largely skeletal legs spread apart and arms to his side that were crudely cut to their bones, leading to hands that were still fully skinned. His remaining corpse was a putrid mass of organs encased in an almost fully flayed torso, which led to an almost still living face, completely with a thick red beard and bushy hair. The lack of noticeable decay in his face suggested that he had been the last to die, so that wasn't wrong. The top of Bell's skull had been ripped open and his brains were lying on the ground beneath him. The 3 men whose bodies were still intact or partially intact had flesh and muscle cut out of from choice in meaty locations. No attempt had been made to consume bone marrow or any organs at all. The state of the bodies immediately countered Alfred's version of events. They were all together in one spot, not scattered across miles. Both Humphrey and Noon had large portions of remaining flesh, muscle, organs, and more that could have been consumed long before Bell gave in to the madness of hunger and attempted to murder Alfred, as he had claimed. The men had poor condition clothes lashed to their rotting feet, which had replaced the shoes they had eaten in their desperation, and moldy and tattered blankets lay beneath and beside them. A beaten path went from the resting place of the corpse to a crude shelter that was used by Alfred, and there was evidence to suggest that the deaths had occurred before supplies were totally exhausted. Within the shelter were possessions of the men that Alfred had left behind. The theory at the time was that Alfred killed the men before supplies ran out to rob them of their possessions, get snowed in, and then lived in his makeshift shelter for months, walking to his slain companions and slicing meat off as needed. Preston accompanied the party to the site and identified the bodies as the missing men. Owing to the damage apparent on the remains, it is presumed that it was used to bat 1 or more of them. Their remains were buried at the site by officials, and the search party returned to Alfred's makeshift jail to confront him, only to find him missing. This next part, honestly, it's just dumb. Like, The jail in question was little more than a log cabin located on ranch property belonging to the Saguache County Sheriff. It's a cabin. Of course, he's going to be able to escape. Months had passed with no final evidence of a crime having been committed, no bodies discovered, and no formal charges lodged against Alfred other than the attempt of Lauder's life, which was not closely sought for prosecution and used more as a means to keep him under custody. Alfred was reportedly passed a makeshift key for his irons and given some supplies and easily escaped. I don't know, I don't really believe that, honestly. Even so, nearly the entirety of Sawatch was convinced, either through rumor or rational deduction, that he was guilty of either robbery or murder. His life was threatened constantly by the nearby townspeople. Alfred never revealed who helped him escape, how this was achieved, or even why. It was presumed that his guard had been bribed by Alfred himself or by someone else. I don't know, I still don't believe that. The most accepted theory at the time was that Alfred had inserted himself to the party under highly overstated qualifications of being a mountain guide familiar with the area in order to accompany the men to Brickage, and had, at best, led his party to miserable deaths due to high incapability. This was enough of a crime in itself as far as the local population was concerned. However, an ultimately more popular theory was that he had set out with his party of 5 men from Array's camp with a premeditated plan to lead them into the wilderness where he would kill and rob them. Regardless as to how it may have happened, almost the entire population of Sawatch, and soon nearly the entire country and beyond, found that Alfred's fault for his party's death was beyond doubt. The cannibalism part of his charges, although shocking, was not necessarily the major issue of his guilt. People at the time were well familiarized with the story of the ill-fated donor party who had resorted to cannibalism during the winter of 1946 to 1947, were understanding to a degree of the terrible need to eat in the unforgiving wilderness. Additionally, cannibalism was not, then or now, illegal per se in the United States, unless one committed murder in order to obtain the flesh to be consumed. In the end, it came down to the question, did 5 men die due to incompetence or greed? So I'm going to stop it right here. This video is going to be in 2 parts. So this is number 1, and part 2 will be posted tomorrow around the same time. So I hope you guys enjoyed part 1. Please check out part 2 when it comes out, and thank you for watching.